The first thing to think about in deciding to grow container gardens in general is, what is it exactly that you want to grow? Whether that be seasonal color, warm season annuals, cool season annuals, perennials, small shrubs, vegetables, maybe a water garden. Keep in mind that cool season annual color, those plants generally stay small and don't develop an extensive root system, so they don't need as big of a container. Where some of our perennials that may be short-lived, may live a little bit longer, they will develop more of a root system and need a little bit larger container as opposed to what our seasonal color. And then to step up from there, some small shrubs, say roses, little lime hydrangea, and some of the other shrubs, they will need adequate room for root growth. Otherwise, you may need to repot every couple of years, replenish that soil, prune some roots. So you're looking at a little bit larger containers. And then again, vegetable containers will need to provide plenty of room for roots and then support for that upper growth. So tomatoes that grow a little bit taller, some of our peppers, eggplants, you want to make sure that they have plenty of room for root growth and development to also be able to support anything vegetative you see growing above the ground. So again, deciding what it is that you want to grow will help drive that decisions on the size and the material of the container that you need. In order to choose the right container, I'd say there really is no perfect container for every solution, every situation. It's going to range on, again, what it is you're trying to grow. You can get containers that are teeny tiny, all the way up to 3 to 5 foot wide pots and even bigger, and anywhere in between. On plastics, there's materials on plastics. You can get ceramics, terracotta, containers made out of cement and stone and even wood. On some of the ceramics and the terracottas, they can be painted, they can be glazed, sealed, natural. Again, such a wide range of containers. And then whether you want them to be movable on casters or raised sections, those will allow you to be able to move the containers indoors for winter or into a greenhouse, into the garage, so that you can protect that plant material when we do get some of these cold spells. The other benefit of having some containers is in terms of their mobility. If you get to an area that the plants are getting just so much sun and you want to be able to move them into an area that gets a little bit more shade, having those plants in containers, that is easier to do versus plants that are in the ground. They're pretty much fixed, just like the fruit trees. You're planting them there with the intention that is where they're going to stay. So on the screen, you see just, again, that wide range of materials available. One thing to keep in mind on the plastic containers, the thinner the plastic, you may get 1 summer out of them. You may be able to get 2 years out of them at most. The longer they stay in the sun, you go to pick those up, the plastic becomes very brittle. And so that can be a bit of an issue, as opposed to some of the resin planters or the composite planters. They're a little more expensive, so they're going to be pricier than the plastic containers, but they're generally more durable, weather resistant. Some are lightweight, some are a little bit heavier. But again, that durability to me makes it worth that little bit extra in terms of the initial investment, because I'm going to have those for a longer period of time. On terracotta containers, one item or one issue to keep in mind, especially if you're using terracotta containers in the sun, is that in the sun or also in very windy conditions, that soil inside the terracotta is going to dry out so much quicker than if it was, say, even a terracotta with a glaze or some sort of outside finish. So that natural terracotta That soil dries out so much quicker. So just keep that in mind. You may need to water more often. Terracotta and the glazed containers. You notice after we get a cold snap like the winter storm we had last month, you go to move some of those containers that are out in the landscape, you may notice that they've chipped, they may have broken completely. So they don't have quite that resistance to the extreme weathers as say some of the resin or the composite planters do. So again, choosing the right container, it's really a matter of taste, budget, weight. If you're planning on having to move these containers indoors and outdoors, you can either get containers that have casters or add those on afterwards. I would say anything that can hold a reasonable amount of soil. We say potting soil, you'll notice it's really more of a potting mix when we get to that point in the discussion a little bit later. So you can really use any and everything that will, again, hold that potting mix in place. Drainage is absolutely critical. And one thing to keep in mind whenever we're talking about the size of the containers that are used, especially when it gets to planting perennials, small shrubs, maybe even some small dwarf fruit trees, the size of that container and the limited soil capacity will ultimately end up restricting the size that the plant will grow. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on whenever we're looking at plant materials and we look at the label in the nursery. If you plant those different plants into containers, you may notice they may not get quite as big as what was specified on that label, and that is directly related back to the size of the container and the amount of soil or potting mix that is used. So we know on drainage, we have a container. How many of you have either seen this or heard, you may have seen it online or heard from a friend that it's easy as getting a container, dumping some rocks in the bottom, adding the potting mix on top, and you've got instant drainage. We'll go through why that's not quite as simple and as straightforward as you may think. So first and foremost, when you go to get those containers, you want to check to see if they already have drainage holes or if they don't. If they don't, we need to come up with some different solutions on what it would take to be able to either drill new drainage holes in there or maybe using a smaller container that you just set down inside and you use that more decorative container as simply a place to display where the plants are not planted directly into this container. Again, you never want to use a container without addressing the ultimate drainage of the water that you're using to irrigate or rainwater, whatever the case may be. So we talked about just a couple slides back, the myth of adding that layer of drainage material. And I'll admit, I used to do this mostly because it was, if I put the rocks down at the bottom, then I'm not buying as much of my potting mix. And it adds a little bit of weight to the container, so I don't have to worry about it getting tipped over in windy conditions. So again, this is a myth that this is what you do not want to do. And I'll walk you through on why that's the case. So if we have those rocks at the bottom and you go in, you have the potting media on top of that, and it rains, that water is going to percolate down through the potting media and it will sit down in what we'll call a saturation zone. So you can see at the bottom, the container on the left does not have any rocks or any material. So that water has moved down all the way through the potting media and will exit out the drainage holes. If we place rocks, especially like a pea gravel that will compact together, and we add that potting media on top, the potting media will work its way down in and around the crevices. But what you'll notice when you water, that saturation zone moves up into more of the growing root zone for the plants. So if you notice in the picture, the roots for this root ball are all surrounding, and roots go all the way down to the bottom. What we don't want to have, and I'm going to flip back to the other slide, we don't want to have the roots with this water level, the saturation zone, further up into the container, because we can go in and we can mess with the oxygen levels, and we can essentially end up drowning our plants by keeping that much water in the containers. Now, there are a couple of ways to address that. So again, for containers that don't have drainage holes, you can go ahead and add those. Very easy to do on wooden containers with just a standard drill bit. With the ceramic or stone containers, you want to make sure that it's a drill bit labeled specifically for that type of material. And I even have been growing some vegetable plants in 5-gallon containers. They're food grade containers that I purchased from Lowe's. And I go in the bottom of those 5-gallon buckets, I drill 3 half-inch holes at the bottom for adequate drainage, because the last thing I want to do is limit that water movement through the containers to where I end up keeping that potting media just completely saturated. That is something that you absolutely want to avoid. The next myth that we'll debunk is covering the drainage hole. You can see in some of these pictures, they've used coffee filters, some fine mesh screen, some other. You really don't need to address covering the drainage hole. That potting media, after you fill up the container and plant, as you water in, that potting media will settle some, but you don't have to worry about excessive loss of that media through the drainage holes. So I would say there's not really any good reason on needing to cover the drainage holes. Now, what you'll notice is some people like to use some larger containers, like these plastic bottles, is a way to reduce the weight, especially in larger containers. Still want to be able to move around. This is a little bit different as compared to using the stones or using pea gravel down at the bottom. The water can still move through here. The potting media will still flow through, but it's not quite the same as worrying about that compaction of all of those pea gravel pieces shifting into place and essentially forming a false bottom in the container. So there are some cases where this is warranted. I try not to even do this anymore, but the key is to not cover the drainage holes, and then it still allows for the potting media to reach the bottom of that container. Again, otherwise you'll have to worry about that water perching higher up into the container. So a couple of other considerations to make whenever choosing containers for container gardens. Heavier plants or heavier containers are better for taller, top-heavy plants. And the worst thing you want to come home after working all day and find some of your containers knocked over on their side because the wind was so strong that those top-heavy plants, it just took a hold of that and knocked everything down. Again, like I mentioned earlier, porous materials like the terracotta will allow soil to dry out faster. And you want to avoid over-potting your plants whenever you're installing them into the container. What that means is you want to avoid using such a big container in proportion to the size of the plant. And just because aesthetically it looks out of proportion, it can also make the odds of overwatering that container more likely because you have so much potting media in the container. Well, the roots of that smaller plant are not going to have quite the same needs. And so you can very easily overwater or keep that potting media too saturated. A common issue that you see, especially using containers on, say, wooden decks, is if you go to move a container, you've seen where it has a ring around it. Using some little pot feet, which some are very decorative, some are a little more simple, that can help, again, make sure that you have adequate drainage and that drainage hole is not blocked for the bottom of the container, so that water can move easily through the space and drain on out the bottom, and you're not having plants sitting in water for extended periods of time. You can get creative. Here they use just some wine corks. Same thing out for containers sitting in soil. So this is a much larger bed, and they have two glazed containers out there. Again, if those heavy containers were sitting on the soil, we might worry about either roots growing out of the drainage holes, or that potting media becoming compacted against the soil in the existing bed, and then we'd have an issue with water retention. So elevating those containers, again, just provides an added benefit to make sure that we don't have too much water staying in that potting media. So we'll discuss a little bit on potting mixes. You never want to go in and use garden soil or topsoil for your containers. So I would highly recommend using these blended. Some of the bags will say soil, some will say potting mix. None of what you see on the screen is a true soil. So again, so even if the bag says potting soil, they're more of a potting mix. But these have been specifically formulated for container plantings, and you really want to use materials like this and not a topsoil or a garden soil. One, because a topsoil may not provide adequate support for the plant. You have issues on garden soil. They may not drain the same. And again, with these potted containers, you need a media that will drain well and drain rapidly, so the plants, again, are not, those roots are not staying in saturated soil. The potting media will still hold some moisture to prevent the need for constant watering. Now, again, in South Louisiana or Central Louisiana, in middle of summer, all bets are off. So you may still need to go in and check maybe every day just to see if they do need water. The potting media in the bags theoretically should be free from pathogens and weed seeds. I found that's not always the case, but that's more of an issue with some of the mulch. But again, if they have been properly composted and treated before being bagged, this is not an issue that you should really have to encounter. Most potting mixes are going to be a mix of peat moss, vermiculite, perlite, sand, and some compost. It is possible to mix your own. You can find some different recipes online. With larger projects, you might find it being a little more cost effective to go in and source all the materials and mix it up on your own. For smaller projects, a lot of times it's just more convenient to go in and purchase. I would say when you go in to buy the bags of potting mix, you want to avoid those that are real heavy or dense. And then also when you open the bag, if they're real black or they have some powdery substance on there, if it's real powdery inside the bag, it may not have adequate water holding capacity. So you may need to mix in some other potting mix ingredients to make sure that it's a mix that will work best for you. Watering your container plants, for the most part, is one of the easiest parts of growing plants in containers, as long as you use containers with drainage holes. Now, again, when you water, and this is true for outdoor container plants as well as those that are inside, you want to water to the point to where some of that water leaches out through the drainage holes. If you, especially for inside plants, if you water so lightly that the water never comes out of the drainage holes, what you'll notice at the top is these little white crystals, and that is salt that is beginning to build up and accumulate forming an upper soil crust on those containers. So that means that the water hasn't reached the bottom of the container to actually be able to leach those salts out of the drainage holes. So what I would recommend on indoor plants is to take them outside every once in a while, water to the point where it comes out of the drainage holes, just to make sure that those salts and everything is moving through the soil and not being held in that upper crust. You can use a breaker to soften the force of the water. You'll notice most of the small little plastic watering cans have a detachable breaker. So you can take that off and the water will come out more forcefully, or you can add that on and it'll break it up into smaller droplets. Again, just like watering plants in the landscape, when you water container plants, you want to avoid wetting the foliage. So when to water, what I would say is go in, and the best way is to check the moisture levels by feeling the soil. And when you check, don't check right there on the top. You want to remove the mulch or move that soil out of the way. Check a good 2 inches or so down, and you'll be able to tell if there's adequate moisture in that container. If it's extremely dry, the plants are probably starting to show signs of wilt. So you want to go ahead and water. Smaller containers, you can actually pick that up, and you can feel by the weight of the container if you need to water. You can look at the color of the soil. That's not always the best indicator, just simply because of the way some of these container mixes are formulated. Some naturally have different colors. So if you're not used to, and maybe you buy a new product, let's go with the new brand, it may throw you off a little bit. Once you kind of know what the water use of the plants are, it's pretty easy to determine the schedule based on, feeling that soil, and you want to make sure that you follow that. Now, you can watch the plants, and if they have slight wilt, it's okay. I prefer the plants, at least in my yard, to be a little bit on the drier side as opposed to being too wet. So again, I would say using that as your only signal, I would not recommend at all, but you can allow those plants to dry out a little bit to where they have just a slight wilt to them, and overall not going to harm. Now, if you did that every time you watered, then you would notice a decrease in productivity, decrease in growth. The problem with just relying on the plants to wilt is that overwatering of container plants can resemble that of underwatered plants. So if you were to walk by and see this plant without checking the container, you might automatically assume, oh, it needs some water. Walk by a watering can right there and water it. You may feel that soil, and it is so saturated that it can't take another drop of water. So again, you don't want to go by look alone. You want to go in and feel that soil just to double check everything. Other factors that increase the chances of overwatering, like I mentioned earlier, overpotting, to where you have so much media in proportion to the amount of roots that the plants have. Heavy soils that stay wet, and this is another reason you don't want to go with a garden soil, especially that has a lot of clay in it, that will naturally stay a little bit on the wet side. And then also allowing a plant to sit in a saucer full of water. This is the other detriment that I commonly see on interior plants. So one end of the spectrum is not watering enough to where it leaches those soils out. The other is allowing that plant to sit in a saucer full of water. Well, then the water, when more water is added to the container, it has nowhere to go because that soil is already fully saturated. On fertilizing container plants, most of the potting mixes are going to be low in nutrients, but what you'll notice is a lot of the vendors will go in and add fertilizers, and some will even add some micronutrients in, and that will typically get you, even though if the bag says it'll feed for 9 months, with the amount of rain and the humidity that we have, especially in central and south Louisiana, you might get about 6 to 8 months out of it. The more often you water and more often it rains, you're going to lose some of those nutrients out of the soil. And then also the roots that are combined and combining the multiple plants inside of a container, those plants are going to be competing for nutrients. So you want to make sure that you apply adequate fertilizer so that they are not stressing each other out, trying to fight for the limited reserves in the potting mix and in that container. Most fertilizers, you can choose either a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. You can go with a 3-1-2. You'll notice that a lot of the fertilizers commercially available for blooming plants will be a little bit higher in phosphorus, so they may be a 1-2-1. What I would say when it comes to looking at fertilizer forms is to choose what works best for you. There are different fertilizers available on the market. You can go with something organic. You can go with the soluble. The key to the soluble, and that would be something like a water-soluble Miracle-Gro, is they have to be reapplied regularly. The soluble fertilizers are not meant to be long-term. So the other option would be, if you want something a little longer lasting, would be slow release. You can get either the little stakes, a lot of times you see those on trees, or you can get, they're encapsulated and little prills or beads, and those are typically you will get somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 months out of that fertilizer. Key to fertilizer, I'd say, is follow the label directions, just like everything that we harp on here in the Ag Center on. Follow those label directions in regards to the frequency and the rate. It's okay to use a little bit less. You don't want to use more than what is recommended, just like Michael talked about burning the roots of the fruit trees if you fertilize when planting. Same thing can happen with the container plants. Fertilizer is going to be most useful when the plant is in active growth. So if it is a perennial plant, it's broken dormancy in sometime late February or March, it will use that fertilizer all the way through, and then the plants will naturally decrease in productivity as we get into the late summer, early fall months. What you don't want to encourage is adding fertilizer throughout the year to where the plants get too big, because again, that encouraging the growth of those plants in those containers, you end up using more water. And then what I mentioned earlier in the presentation in terms of the size of the containers, you're going to limit that root growth. So it's sending two different signals to the plant of, I'm trying to grow, but my root surface area in the soil is limited. So you don't want to fertilizer all year long. Again, follow those label directions and go from there. In terms of light, it's very easy to evaluate light conditions for container plants. You want to go in and choose plants that will thrive in the light conditions where you plant them. Nice thing about containers is if they're getting a little bit too much light, you can go in and move them into some shade. All of the plants, if you're combining multiple plants, all the plants in that one container must enjoy the same light conditions. And what I would recommend is go in just like landscape design, same thing with container plants, familiarize yourself with the type of light that the different parts of your landscape receive. Light terms on shady areas, they may get no direct morning light at all. They may get about 2 hours or dappled light sometime during the day. Part shade are those areas that get about 4 hours of direct morning sun. Part sun, somewhere 4 to 6 hours of sun, and then full sun are those plants that can take 8 or more hours of direct sunlight. Quickly talking about plant material and maintenance. We're going to go through in the interest of time. On annual color, when you go to purchase those plants, it's always a good idea to look for stocky and sturdy plants. You want to avoid those that are real leggy or they're starting to droop over. On perennial plants, again, looking for the same material, stocky, sturdy plants. On perennials, I always recommend inspecting the roots because you want to make sure that those plants are not root bound, and look for good root color. What I mentioned earlier, the plant labels will have mature height and width. Keep in mind, if you grow those plants in containers, they may not live up to that, to get to be quite at that big, because that container size is going to limit their overall potential. So quickly talking about composition on container plants, this is a great example of what not to do. There's so many different colors. You have 4 plants that are growing upright, 1 that's trailing down. It's really just a hodgepodge of plant materials. Again, not my recommendation of what your container plant should look like. You'll hear the term thriller, filler, and spiller. So in this case, the thriller is that upright plant, Angelonia, filler being that kind of mid-level plant. These are the petunias in this picture. And then spiller, the ornamental sweet potato plant, and have that broken down. If you have a container and you go with just 3 different plants with this concept, you will almost be guaranteed to have a nice looking container arrangement based just on that thriller, filler, spiller guideline. I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of some plant combinations. This is 3 different plants in this container. This one is actually 5 different plants. So you have, again, that heliconia, which is the very tallest. It's false bird of paradise, all the way down to the weeping, kind of the spiller is the ornamental sweet potato vine. So again, very nice. Went with warm color combinations. You go with all coleus. So again, different shapes to the leaves, different textures, different colors. So again, combining. So it's really playing up what it is that you like to see. Repeating different combinations of plants. So here they took the same exact design on either side of the entrance to the pool and repeated. And I would say if it works, you can do it again. Same thing on growing container vegetables, keeping in mind the amount of sun and the potting mix and the water needs, and you would have a very successful container garden on vegetables or ornamental plants.